The movie starts in a deserted town with empty streets, shops closed, and everywhere really silent. Dell, who seems to be the sole survivor of an apocalyptic event, soon unlocks a door to an abandoned house and goes in. He picks up a couple of things including batteries, after which he then moves around the house until he comes across a picture of the family who owns the house, which he then happens to leave with. As he gets out, he marks an X in front of the house to show that he had cleaned it up. He then gets into his truck and starts driving off until he stops at a library. On entry, he first places a couple of books he found in the house back on the shelf. In the morning, Dell marks a couple of spots on a map, looking for where he should head to next. Soon after, he gets into his car and leaves for another abandoned house. When he gets in this time, he sees two bodies and then wraps them up, after which he cleans parts of the house and also takes the family photo again before he heads out. Before he leaves though, he takes some gas off the car in the garage and then loads up the bodies into his truck, headed for a cemetery. When he gets there, he has to then drag the bodies one after the other in a field that has many recently dug graves. He finally throws the body into an empty hole and then covers it up. From the cemetery, he heads over to the lake for a fishing trip, and later that night, he eats and then watches a movie before heading to bed. As he's sleeping, he suddenly hears a loud bang and is shocked as to what he's heard. When he goes over to look out the window, he discovers that it's fireworks. The next morning, he then heads over in the direction he had seen the fireworks, only to see a crashed car overheating. As he checks to see what's going on, he finds a lady passed out in the front seat, with a couple of things including a gun also among her possessions. A while later, the lady named Grace is on a bed with a bandage around her head. She wakes up surprised to see herself in the room and immediately tries to get out, but the door is locked. She then tries to call on whoever is around, and just then Dell responds, asking if there were any other people alive. She says there are none and asks for Dell to open the door, but he refuses to do it immediately, not sure about whether he wanted her to see him. Later on, he opens the door, and just as he is about to leave immediately, she comes out to see him. Dell, however, hurriedly leaves the house, but he's followed by Grace, who asks why she's not smelling anything. Dell says he's buried all the bodies, and then gives her keys to a car, telling her to leave as he walks away. Looking disappointed, Grace then tells him she wants to stay, questioning how he happened to be satisfied with being alone. However, Dell doesn't seem to care, wishing her good luck as he continues walking away as Grace looks on. As he's on a fishing trip later that day, Grace comes around and Dell doesn't exactly look happy to see her. She then tries to offer her help to him later on, but he just ignores. That night, she joins him at the library to eat, and there, she asks several questions, though he answers only a few, including that he used to work at the library and he had been sleeping when everyone died. Just then, as she continues to ask questions about whether he was lonely or not, he insinuates that he didn't like company even when people in the town were around. With that, she tells him she'll leave. Back outside, Grace gets into her car and suddenly yells, disappointed she had to leave. But before she can even start the car, Dell offers her to stay in what he called a trial period, and this draws a smile on her face. With that, Dell and Grace then continue going about their business until he sees her going to a different part of town. He follows her and then asks her what she's doing, and she says she only wanted to help bury the bodies and clean the house. But Dell says he would do that. When she gives a concerned look though, he agrees. He then tells her about taking batteries from gadgets in the house as well as also cleaning all the garbage in the house. He also then looks to get a book that the lady who lived in the house borrowed, and with Grace's help, he finds it. When he's done, they both head to the cemetery where he puts the body into the dug grave and immediately wants to cover it up. However, Grace looks surprised, asking if he wasn't going to say anything. She then insists for them to hold their breath for 10 seconds to pay their respect to the dead, and despite being reluctant at first, Dell joins her and they do it together. They then later go on to scavenge for things, after which Grace seems to be really enjoying herself while Dell drives them back to the library. When they're back, Dell seems to go out again, and in her search to check if he was in the library, Grace stumbles on all the laptops and then pictures of all the people in the town that Dell had stored, and before he can come back, she immediately puts it all back and leaves. She then heads out on a bicycle and eventually goes into an abandoned house where she finds a dog, much to her surprise. She then takes the dog back to the library, and even though he's not happy with it, Dell allows it. Grace then later joins Dell on his fishing trip, with Dell catching 2 fishes in the process, and then cooking it for them as a meal that night while they have an interesting conversation about a goldfish. The next day, Grace wakes up to look at the mirror and suddenly, she lifts her hair to show a red stitch mark on the back of her neck. Later on, while Grace is playing around as she's looking for the dog, she sees it eating the pages of a book, which she immediately tries to clean up. When Dell sees this though, he's not happy and even wants to take the dog away from her, but the dog bites him in the process, forcing him to leave. Later that night, as he's trying to clean and stitch his hand, Grace then comes over to help him, and he thanks her. Quite early the next day, while he's going out to pee, he sees the dog at the entrance and stares at it furiously. Much later, Grace then comes over to wake Dell, saying that she's looking for the dog. They then head out in search of it, and as Grace is talking about remembering that she tied the dog, Dell mentions that he let it out, and Grace doesn't quite understand this as she looks pissed. When they return to the library after searching for a while, Grace has a few drinks before she then confronts Dell with all the pictures he had been keeping, saying the people were only objects to him and he didn't have anyone for him while she did, showing how pissed she was while talking about how her father and mother died. Before she leaves, she throws all the pictures on Dell. The next day, Dell develops the courage to face Grace after the previous night and sees her things packed on a table, with a picture of her family in between a book. When she comes out, she's surprised to see Dell, and then he tells her he wanted to show her something. From there, he takes her to a greenhouse where there are plants around. He then tells her he'd need her help with clearing the other bodies if she wanted to help, looking sorry for what had happened earlier. The next day, they then get back to working together to clean up and then bury the bodies. Together, they also set up a solar panel to get power, after which they also get walkie-talkies to help them find each other. Later on, while she's preparing to head out, she picks her hair up but suddenly drops it back after seeing the red stitch mark again. Grace then leaves on her bicycle and reaches an abandoned house, passing on the message to Dell via the walkie-talkie. As she's inside getting prepared to clean the house and take the body away, Dell comes in looking rather confused. She then mentions that the house was not on the map, and just then, Dell tells her she's not supposed to be there. She then discovers that the place was personal to him. Despite being hesitant at first, they end up cleaning the place and then bury the body as well. As they're leaving, Grace says she's got something to tell Dell, though instead she kisses him. When she pulls away, he kisses her back, and together they head back to the house she was staying in. The next morning, Dell wakes up but doesn't find Grace on the bed with him. The sound of laughter downstairs then prompts him to search for Grace's gun, and as he goes down, he sees Patrick and Violet, who claim to be Grace's parents, with Grace looking scared at the table. They ask him to join them at the table, after which they tell him that Grace had ran away from home, and they weren't the only ones alive, with thousands of other people around where they're from. Feeling betrayed, Dell can't help but stare at Grace, who is still looking anxious and uncomfortable by the presence of Patrick and Violet. Dell then storms out of the house, with Grace following him. Outside, she begs him not to leave, saying she was paired with them when she got to California, and that he doesn't understand what they're doing to her, but Dell doesn't want to hear any of it, driving off in the process. A while later, Violet goes to meet Grace, mentioning that she was worried for Grace and only wanted her to come back with her, telling her they had to be a real family. Elsewhere, Patrick meets with Dell, saying he wanted an audiobook for their journey. He then tries to convince Dell to come with them, saying they had a team of doctors working on new ways to harness the complexity of the human mind. Dell doesn't seem interested, but Patrick still writes him the address and leaves. Later on, Grace then holds back tears and is looking really scared at the back of the car as Patrick is driving away. It also seems that Violet has the same stitching to the back of her neck as Grace. With Grace gone, Dell becomes alone again, and this time it gets to him. After a while, he then decides to look for the address that Patrick wrote for him and even has to scatter the library before he finds it. He then goes on the journey to California, which takes days, and he changes cars a couple of times. He eventually locates Patrick's house and goes close to see what's happening there. As he's looking, Violet sees him but pretends not to when Patrick asks if she saw anything. With this, Dell returns to his car and waits for the family to turn off all the lights, after which he goes in with a gun and finds several wires connected to Grace. He also then sees the stitching at the back of her neck. When Grace becomes conscious, he apologizes for not listening to her and then helps her disconnect all the wires. The next morning, Dell and Grace meet Patrick as they're about to leave, and Patrick is surprised to see Dell, telling him they needed to talk while Grace went back to rest. Dell then asks what he's doing to Grace, and Patrick says he's trying to eliminate all her negative feelings and make her forget the past, just like they were doing with other people in the town too. As he starts to get detailed, Grace fires at him and he dies, much to the surprise of Dell and then Violet, who comes out and talks about having a daughter before she leaves the house. After that, Grace heads over to join Dell in the car, with a goldfish in hand. Dell then drives them out of town amidst people staring at them as they leave. While they're on the road, Grace then apologizes for shooting Patrick, but Dell insinuates that he doesn't have a problem with it, hitting a button to take off the top of the car and smiling as he drives off. And that is how it ended. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. And if you would like to give this a watch for yourself and support the movie, we always link it in the description below to save you the trouble. Thanks for watching.